In this video, we're having a look at projectile motion and specifically the Magnus effect. So Magnus is another scientist who followed in the footsteps of Bernoulli and applied that principle to rotating projectiles. So Bernoulli, we've already covered, applied his principle, or we apply that principle to projectiles without spin. So to the discus, to the javelin, and to the ski jumper. But we can also apply Bernoulli's principles, remember, to an object that's travelling through the air, might not be a projectile, such as a track cyclist or a Formula One car. Magnus is now adding to that by applying that very same principle to an object with spin. So this is about how we get that additional force. With Bernoulli, we got lift or downward lift, an additional force created due to either the shape of an object, its aerodynamics, or the angle of attack of the object. With Magnus, it's not really to do with the shape or the angle of attack, it's to do with the fact that that object is spinning in the air. And it creates exactly the same, it creates this pressure gradient. So the Magnus effect is the creation of an additional force on a rotating projectile that makes it deviate from its flight path. And we're going to have a look at those flight paths in a moment. Magnus Force is the name of the force. So with Bernoulli, we got lift and downward lift forces being created. With Magnus, it's called the Magnus Force, and it's created in exactly the same way due to this pressure gradient on the opposing surfaces or sides of that rotating body as it moves through the air. So Magnus Force, the force that's created, this additional force that pulls the object or the projectile from left to right or up or down, causes the Magnus effect, causes that projectile to deviate somewhere in the air. So let's remind ourselves about this principle of air velocities and pressure gradients. We have our shape here. I'm going to go with an aerofoil shape in this example, and we have our air being taken on the rounded side of the shape the long way around, and in my drawing I'm depicting that by drawing the lines close together. Now it's literally just dawned on me that in the last video I don't think I drew arrows on the airflow lines, and that is really important. So go back to your notes that we did last lesson when we looked at Bernoulli and make sure you have added these arrows to the airflow lines. We've got our direction of motion of our projectile, but we need the airflow being shown to go in the opposite direction. That's my fault. I'm pretty sure I forgot that last time. And on the underside of this projectile, the lines are much further away. So I need to make sure I make clear what I mean by this. So here I've got now high velocity air, because it's being forced the long way around, and here I've got low velocity air because it's being allowed to go the short distance. That's resulting in low pressure air and high pressure air on opposite sides, on opposing sides of the projectile, and that's causing a pressure gradient, which is pushing in this direction in this case, and therefore in this case is going to create lift force. Let's remind ourselves again about downward lift. So in this case, I'm going to draw that aerofoil shape inverted. So the flat side on the bottom, the flat on the top and the rounded side on the bottom. Again, I'm going to draw it going this way, and my airflow line's coming in this direction. This time this air is being forced the long way around like this. I'm going to draw tight lines in order to show high velocity air. So these lines nice and close together. I'll draw more air on this side, so I'm going to draw 4 on this side and then just 2 on this side. Spread out. Again, I would need to label it high velocity, low pressure. If you were in the exam, you would actually write these words. Low velocity, high pressure, high pressure, that's creating a pressure gradient. It's doing this to the object and it's creating downward lift force. And remember, we talked about this upward lift force being generated on a discus that has an angle of attack of 17 degrees, which causes this air to come the long way around at that 17 degrees, causing low pressure and therefore lift. We had our javelin at 5 degrees, again causing the air to come the long way around, creating that lift force. And we had our ski jumper somewhere between like 20 and 45 degrees, and we had that big window due to all the other variables. So we're creating the air going the long way around on the discus, the javelin and the ski jumper due to those angles of attack. And then our practical example with this downward lift force was our track cyclist or our Formula 1 car that wants to stick to the road around those bends to allow them to accelerate with greater speeds around the bends. Okay, so let's look at how this then relates to the Magnus Force. So the Magnus Effect. So in sport we refer usually to a rotating object as having spin. So spin is created, and we know how rotation is created. Rotation is created by the application of an eccentric force. And so that is how we're creating spin in these examples. So in this case, we're looking at top spin. So top spin is when we apply a force above the centre of mass. So we're looking at this tennis ball in this case from the side view. So it's the transverse axis that the ball is rotating around. To create top spin, we apply the eccentric ball above the centre of mass, and it causes the ball to rotate sort of downwards here. Causes it to rotate clockwise as we look at it about that transverse axis. And all spin is going to create a non-parabolic flight path. So let's look at specifically the flight path that would be created through top spin. So as I say, we're going to draw this from the side because the rotation's about the transverse axis, and we're going to along the sagittal plane so we can see it best from the side. So we would draw in our tennis ball here, and we would draw its flight path without spin. Okay, so without spin it would be pretty parabolic. Okay, and then we're going to compare that to when this ball has top spin. So when the ball has top spin, it's going to travel downwards much more quickly. Okay, and we'll have a look at why in a minute. So this is our flight path of our ball with top spin. The ball is called dips when it's got top spin. It travels a shorter horizontal distance, and actually when it hits the ground it would then bounce forwards and skid on very quickly. Okay. Then we've got backspin. So this is the same. We're going to look at it from the side view because it's travelling about the transverse axis on the sagittal plane. We're going to apply the eccentric force to the bottom of the ball this time. It's going to cause it to rotate anti-clockwise as we look at it. What's that going to do to its flight path? Well, you can probably guess. We've got our tennis ball. Again, I would draw in the flight path without spin because that helps us to show the deviation then away from that flight path, which is what the Magnus effect is. So with this ball with backspin, it's going to effectively float in the air. So the ball sort of floats, and its horizontal distance is increased from a ball hit with at the same velocity, etc. Its horizontal distance would be increased, and the ball then bounces up at a steep angle, and it really slows down and almost stops in the air after that bounce. Okay. Next, we're going to look at side spin. So here we're changing our view. Here we're imagining you're looking over the top of the ball. So here, for these for backspin and topspin, we're looking at the ball from the side. So we're sat at Wimbledon and we're like facing the net. Whereas for side spin, we need to be looking over the top of the ball, okay, as if we're using Hawkeye. And that's because the ball is now rotating about its longitudinal axis through the top of it, from top to bottom, and it's rotating then either to the left or to the right. Now, it is a tennis ball obviously in the picture here, but actually the specification refers to tennis balls and table tennis balls with side spin, so that could be spinning to the left or to the right, referred to as side spin. A football referred to as side spin, but a golf ball specifically referred to as hook and slice. So I've got it with a tennis ball here, but really if we're talking about a hook and a slice specifically, in the exam it would be referring probably to a golf ball, but it's the same. So a side spin is now where we're applying the eccentric force to the side of the ball. So if we're looking over the top of it, this eccentric force is being applied to the right-hand side of the ball this time, causing the ball to spin anti-clockwise. And in golf, it would be a hook. So let's have a look at, again, what that's going to cause. So I've got my ball. It could be a table tennis ball, a tennis ball, a football, or a golf ball. This would be its normal flight path with no spin. A hook shot, or one where the eccentric force is applied to the right hand side of the ball, is going to cause the ball to deviate to the left. Okay, so this is a hook or side spin. But obviously, where a side spin, where the application of the force is to the right hand side of the ball, so it causes the ball to swerve, and in the case of a hook, it causes it to deviate left. And so I'm sure you can work out now with this last type of side spin, with the slice, we've got the eccentric force being applied to the left hand side of the ball, and now we're going to have our ball deviate off to the right. So this would be our normal flight path without spin, and now we've got the ball deviating to the right with side spin, specifically the slice. Okay, so what's that actually going to do? So in golf, as I say, the specification speaks in golf specifically about the hook and the slice. So the hook is causing the ball to deviate left, and the slice would cause the ball to deviate off to the right. A golfer could want to do that to control the flight of the ball in the air. He might want to, or she might want to cause the ball to move around, let's say, a tree. They also might want to control how the ball is landing on the green to stop it from rolling off the green in a certain direction. So that's why a golfer might choose to apply a hook or a slice. Actually, often in golf, when they talk about those shots, it's when they've gone wrong and too much side spin's been applied, and the ball goes sort of off in the incorrect direction. This is a picture though of where a golfer might use backspin, which isn't specifically on the specification, but could use backspin on the green to like hold the ball up to stop it from rolling forward and rolling off the green too far. In tennis and table tennis, the specification talks about topspin, backspin and side spin. So in tennis, we would use topspin to make that ball drop quickly down to the ground and then skid on quickly. And so that would make it harder for the opponent to meet. Similarly, with backspin in tennis and table tennis, the ball would travel further and then would sit up in the air and slow down after the bounce. And that would confuse the opponent. It would make the opponent have to come towards the ball to play the shot, and therefore move the opponent towards the net. And side spin similarly is going to cause that ball to deviate either left or right in the air, confusing the opponent, doing something that they didn't expect, and causing them hopefully to miss the return. In football, the specification speaks specifically about side spin, And where we see this often in football is players taking free kicks. So we can see both the ball deviating off to the left here and to the right here with the application of side spin. So the footballer here has applied the eccentric force to the left-hand side of the ball, and it's causing the ball to deviate to the right in the air. In this picture, we've got the opposite. So just like we did with the Bernoulli principle and drawing these airflow diagrams, we can draw the airflow diagrams just the same with a spinning object. And it's slightly different, as I said. It's not about the shape of the object, and it's not about the angle of attack of the object. Here, it's about the spinning object, and it's because a spinning object takes more layers of the air the long way around. So that air is going to travel further, and therefore, as we already know, at a high velocity. In this case, we've got top spin. We can see the direction of the ball is travelling from left to right. The airflow lines are travelling from right to left, and the ball is spinning. It's got top spin. So in this case, the upper surface opposes the direction of the airflow. The upper surface of the ball is travelling left to right, but the airflow is travelling right to left. And that decreases the velocity of the air right next to the ball here. On the other side, the lower surface of the ball is rotating right to left with the same direction as the airflow, and that increases the velocity of that airflow right next to the ball. And so again, that's creating, just like it did with the Bernoulli principle, a pressure gradient. We've now got high velocity air with low pressure under the ball, and low velocity air with high pressure over the ball, and that's creating this Magnus effect. We would draw it from the centre of mass of the ball. Okay, it's causing that Magnus effect. It's pulling the ball down to the ground, which is what causes it to dip in terms of its flight path. Okay, so let's have a look at some airflow. I was just going to draw one because we're thinking about now pulling more layers of the air. So if we drew a tennis ball without any spin, I would draw 3 layers of air, probably here, travelling above the ball, and 3 layers of air then travelling below the ball. This is no spin. So I've got similar distances between the airflow lines and the same amount of air travelling below and above. Okay, and that's not going to cause any deviation. We're not going to see any sort of Magnus effect there because there's no spin. With a spinning tennis ball though, or table tennis ball, or golf ball, or football, say it would be exactly the same. We've got our ball here. We're now going to draw, with the top spin, more layers of the air travelling underneath the ball, because the spinning object travelling this way takes this layer of air here underneath it. So I'm going to draw the 4th layer also coming underneath the ball. Okay, so I'm drawing 4 layers coming underneath, and I'm drawing them nice and close together to show that high velocity air. And I'm just going to draw 2 layers of air travelling above the ball. And that way I'm showing that increased number of layers of air travelling underneath the ball. I don't want to forget my direction of motion. Direction of motion is going to be opposite to the airflow lines. I'm now going to make sure that I annotate this. So I've got high velocity, low pressure. I've got low velocity, high pressure. Remember, in the exam you would actually write these words out. I'm just trying to save a little bit of time on the video. We need to show on our diagram actually the way the ball is rotating. So it's rotating that way. I've got my velocity and my pressure, and therefore we've got low pressure here, high pressure here. It's causing a push or pull on the ball this way, and therefore we're going to get our Magnus force now in this direction, and that is what pulls that ball down to the ground when we have topspin. Okay, let's be a bit quicker here. So I've got my tennis ball. I'm going to go in with direction of motion in this direction, and backspin, so it's coming this way. I'm now going to draw airflow lines, more travelling over the ball, tight up here. Obviously in the exam you would take care to make sure that you're drawing it with good accuracy. I've now got high velocity, low pressure, low velocity, high pressure. It's causing sort of this here, and it's going to cause this time Magnus force in this direction. It's pulling the ball upwards, which with the backspin is what causes it to sort of float in the air. Remember, I'm drawing both of these airflow diagrams as if I'm looking at the ball from the side, because this ball is rotating about its transverse axis. Now when we draw airflow diagrams for the hook and the slice for these two types of side spin, we're going to draw the ball as if we're looking over the top of it. So this time the direction of motion is this way. I'm looking over the top of the ball as if I'm hanging above it and it's passing underneath me, because now it's rotating about its longitudinal axis. So with the hook, if I've applied the eccentric force to the right hand side of the ball, this is the spin. It means that the air is going to be forced this way around, so the airflow lines are coming this way. So as this piece of air hits it here, it's going to be dragged around by the ball in the same direction as the spin. High velocity over here, tight arrows. I'm only going to draw one on this side. I'm going to draw, just showing a steeper, a bigger distance there. I've got high velocity, low pressure, low velocity, high pressure. This is causing now a pressure gradient high to low, and it's going to cause Magnus force in this direction, and this is what pulls and causes that ball to deviate with a hook, deviate off to the left. And finally, again looking at it from the top, I've got my direction of motion here. The spinning object, the rotating object this time is rotating this way. Airflow lines are being forced now in this direction, fast around this side of the ball in order to meet the air at the other side, slowly around this side of the ball. So I'm taking more layers of air now this side than this side. It causes high velocity, low pressure, low velocity, high pressure. It's causing the force now, a pressure gradient that wants to move from high to low pressure, and therefore we've got our Magnus force now in this direction, and this is what pulls that ball to the right hand side when we have a slice shot. So that's how to obviously draw the Magnus effect and how to draw the airflow around the ball. If we needed to describe it in words though, we really got to make sure we get in these key terms. So if we're asked to describe Magnus effect or explain how it works, the Magnus effect is obviously this deviations, but we need to get to how we get to the deviation of the ball. So the first thing that we would talk about is the Magnus effect occurs on spinning projectiles. And that's because a projectile with spin takes more layers of air in the same direction as the spin. And at this point, I would bring in a specific example. It's likely that in the exam, it would ask you to talk specifically about topspin or backspin or side spin. But I would choose, and I would say, I'm going to, for example, in topspin, the spinning ball takes more layers of air underneath the ball. Okay, so in this example, the topspin, we're looking from the side. the direction of motion is from left to right. The layers of air, the airflow lines are going from right to left, and the ball is dragging with it more layers of air underneath the ball. So I'd say a spinning object takes more layers of air in the same direction of the spin. For example, with topspin, more layers of air are taken underneath the ball. And that's the direction of the air. More layers of air taken underneath the ball. Those layers of air have to travel then at a higher velocity and underneath the ball, and a lower velocity over the top of the ball. You've got to talk about the top and the bottom because we're trying to get towards describing a pressure gradient here. And to describe a gradient, we've got to describe what's happening at both sides. So the high velocity air is underneath the ball in topspin. The low velocity air is over the top of the ball in topspin. Low velocity air causes high pressure. High velocity air causes low pressure underneath the ball, and low velocity air causes high pressure over the top of the ball, and that creates a pressure gradient. Because fluids move from high pressure to low pressure, this causes the projectile to deviate. In this case, it's going to cause the ball to dip in the air and travel a shorter horizontal distance. So there's a lot to talk about there in explaining Magnus Effect, but we've got to make sure we get in these key terms. The fact that spin controls where the layers of air go. We talk about specific direction of that air by using a specific example. We're going to talk about velocity and therefore air pressures and how that's causing a pressure gradient. What happens when pressure gradients are caused and how that's going to deviate the projectile. So if you pause the video now, it's not long to go, but if you just pause the video, and for yourself create airflow diagrams for a body with an eccentric force being applied above the centre of mass, below the centre of mass, to the right of the centre of mass, and to the left of the centre of mass. Make sure you draw A and B with a side view and C and D with a top view, and think about the direction of motion of the object there. So always include arrows on the airflow lines and the direction of motion and make sure they're opposing. Include an arrow to show the direction of spin. Label the areas high and low pressure. Show more and tighter lines with the same direction of spin. Label the Magnus Force acting from the centre of mass, and state what's going to happen to the ball in each case. So finally, we can also, just like we did for Bernoulli, we can use free body diagrams and resultant force diagrams to really show what's happening to this ball. So if we start with backspin, okay, if we've got our tennis ball here, and we would make sure we drew in the rotation, make sure we show that it's got backspin. Obviously, the ball then has got weight acting from here, and we always need to make sure we draw the direction of motion because our air resistance is acting in the opposite direction to motion. So we have air resistance and weight. Now with backspin, if we just remind ourselves, we've got the ball travelling this way, and therefore we're bringing more layers of air over the top here. That creates high velocity. It creates low pressure. So it's going to move, the ball's going to be moving towards the side with the low pressure. And that gives us then Magnus Force acting in this direction. So this would be our free body diagram for an object, a projectile with spin. The resultant force then, or with backspin, the resultant force then, we're going to take our air resistance. We can forget the ball with the resultant force. We've got our air resistance the same, but just like we did before, we're going to resolve these forces. We need to effectively take Magnus Force away from weight. So here, it's going to give us, if we took that away from that, we are left with a very small effect of weight. We then would draw in our parallel lines and our resultant force, and if I should really, just so I'm clear, have thought about that and make sure that the labels are obvious. So now I've got resultant force in this direction. It means that air resistance is the dominant force rather than weight, and that explains that backspin, it explains that extended horizontal flight path, the ball hanging in the air. So this then is our free body diagram. This is our resultant force diagram for backspin. Let's have a look at topspin. So this time we've got our ball rotating this way. Our direction of motion in this direction. Again, we have air resistance, opposite direction to motion. We have weight. Now in this case, again, let's just remind ourselves, we've got the ball, it's travelling in this direction. It's going to take more layers of the air this way, which gives us high velocity and low pressure on this side of the ball, and things move towards the low pressure. So this time, the Magnus Force is also acting in this direction. So this would be our free body diagram. Resultant force, we've got our air resistance. I probably should draw that just a little bit further up because we're going to have a long line at the bottom. So air resistance. Now we've got Magnus Force plus weight. If we draw in, oh, I've even not drawn it, still not drawn it far enough down. Sorry. Air resistance, Magnus Force plus weight, because now my parallelogram is going to look something like this, and my resultant force is down here. Now resultant force is closer to weight, and therefore it's non-parabolic, and it's going to cause this dip, which we know does happen when the resultant force is closer to weight. So with topspin, this is explaining this non-parabolic flight path, the ball dipping and then spinning off really quickly. Okay, so choose topspin or backspin, create flight path diagram, free body diagram, and a resultant force diagram without looking back at your notes. And then we're going to have a look at some past questions. So this one should be really easy. Identify 2 types of spin and the effect of each on a table tennis ball in flight. 2 types of spin on a table tennis ball: top spin, backspin, side spin. Remember, with the table tennis, you don't need to be specific about hook and slice. It's just referred to as side spin. But it says, and explain the effect. So top spin causes the ball to dip or come down more quickly or with a shorter flight path. Any of those got a mark. Backspin causes the ball to float in the air. Its horizontal distance is greater, elongates the flight path. Side spin causes the ball to swerve in the air, deviate left or right. Okay, a footballer taking a free kick may apply side spin to the ball to make it swerve. Draw and label an airflow diagram of the ball in flight and explain how spin causes the flight path of the ball to deviate. So effectively, explain Magnus Force. So this was the mark scheme here. So for the first bit, draw and label an airflow diagram. So you can see we have the direction of motion in this direction and the airflow lines going in the opposite direction, and that got a mark. We then also drawn on the direction of the spin and the Magnus Force. So it's not obvious on here, and you would want to make it obvious in your diagrams. They're supposed to be wider airflow lines on this side, away from the direction of spin, and closer airflow lines on this side. And really, I would have wanted you to draw more airflow lines on this side as well, because more layers of air are taken in the direction of the spin. This actually then doesn't show on the diagram, but they wanted high pressure being shown where airflow lines are wider, and low pressure where airflow lines are narrower. Direction of spin is matching the direction of the swerve. And so what it hasn't, again, it hasn't shown on this mark scheme, but if you draw your spin coming this way, then you would be showing the Magnus force acting in this direction. And then the explanation, it's caused by the pressure gradient that's created from high to low pressure. The ball travels further on the low pressure side of the ball. Sorry, the air travels further on the low pressure side of the ball and vice versa. Okay. And that's it in terms of past questions. So that's Magnus Force. Remember, the Magnus Effect is the deviation of the ball in the air. It's caused by the Magnus Force, and the Magnus Force is caused by a spinning projectile. The explanation is exactly the same as Bernoulli. It's because of the pressure differences, the pressure gradient being created on each side of the ball. We can draw airflow diagrams to depict that. We can draw flight path diagrams to depict it, free body diagrams, and parallelogram of forces diagrams. So make sure that you've got that you've practiced all of those things.